Hi, I hope everybody is doing well. So let's get started on this. We are talking about the Middle Ages in what is known as present-day France. So we're looking at about the 11th to the 15th century. And in this module, we're going to be looking at the rise of the Capetians and the 12th century Renaissance. So to begin with, let's not forget that we're in the middle of the Crusades. We left off during the Crusades, and this is the Capetian dynasty, and we're going to take a look at a couple things here. So the Capetian lands under the first Capetian, which was WK3, who started in 987. You can see here his territories, which we've looked at before. Which are also on page 76 of your textbook, along with some other maps showing the evolution of territorial expansion of the Capetian dynasty over the centuries. So here what we're looking at is those tiny little kind of turquoise, dark turquoise bubbles, aqua bubbles around Paris and the northern section of France. Those are the Capetian territories. So comparatively speaking, when you look at the other territories, these are not large territories. So these were the Capetian holdings around 987 AD. So by 1477 AD, the Capetian territory looked quite different. So here we have the Capetian holdings in light blue. So as you can see, it covers what we mostly know as France now. There's some areas that are not covered, but you can clearly see the map of France becoming more clear. So very large difference between the first map, where they just have those little bubbles and that's their territories, to the second map, which 500 years later, they are holding quite a bit of what we now know as France. So the question becomes, how did this happen? And let's take a look at that. So how did the Capetian power expand so far? So once again, keep in mind that we are looking at centuries. We're looking at this over centuries. Now, in the 10th and 11th century, when the Capetians began their reign, WK3 became king, but he did so very quietly. He became king of his territories very quietly, did not bring attention to himself. So the Capetian dynasty in the 10th and 11th century stayed under the radar. They did not make a lot of noise, and they were not viewed as a threat. So other lords and kings did not pay great attention to them and did not, they were much more concerned with gaining larger swaths of land versus going after the smaller Capetians. But what the Capetians did have, which was a large advantage, was that they were descended from the Carolingians and the Merovingians. And if you recall, the Carolingians and the Merovingians, one of the defining characteristics of these two dynasties is that they had an alliance with the church, and that the church gave credence to the fact that they were monarchs. So they had a mutually beneficial relationship, and the way that the church helped the Carolingians and the Merovingians was by decreeing that these dynasties were chosen by God, that these lineages were in fact families that were chosen by God and thus were to be monarchs. So the Capetians, the one thing that they really had going for them was that they were descended from the Carolingians and the Merovingians, so they also had this factor of credence because they were descended from a lineage that was chosen by God to rule the Frankish territory. So this gave a religious dimension to the king and kind of elevated his status as not only a statesman, but also as a religious figure. Um, so one other way in which Capetians expanded their power was through marriage. And marriage was an important factor in expanding your territory at the time. So they had a few really good marriages that vastly expanded their territory, like to Eleanor of Aquitaine, which just massively increased the land that they had power over. Now, another way was coercion. This is the Middle Ages, and another way to just gain land is through brute force, which Philip II was well known for. Now, one of their achievements was that they made Paris their capital. So they are now in control of Paris. And another thing that they did, which kind of changed the way the game was played, was that they appointed an heir during their lifetime. So if you remember, one of the problems with Charlemagne's son was that when he died, he had 3 heirs. He had 3 sons, and they divided the territory in 3 ways between those 3 sons. And first of all, that divides the territory into 3, and then the other thing that does is that creates tensions between the 3 and between the people living in the 3, and it turned into somewhat of a disaster where disputes over land just erupted all over the place. So one of the things the Capetians did was that they appointed their heir during their lifetime. So one heir who inherited the whole territory. So that way the territory was not divided between heirs. It was just given to the firstborn son and kept in the family that way. So if you were a second-born son, then, well, that's too bad for you. But for the firstborn son, you inherited the title and you inherited the territories. So as I said, the Capetians were able to kind of fly under the radar, and that is mainly because other territories were busy with their own disputes, so they didn't really pay attention to the Capetians as much as maybe they should have. So, for example, the British were busy with the Vikings, the Normans, and the Germans were in somewhat of a war with the Holy Roman Empire over power of the church versus power of the state. So in the meantime, they were not really busy thinking about the Capetian dynasty and what was happening in that area. They had their own problems to deal with. So I wanted to show you a couple slides. The first one is of the lineage. So you can see, you've seen this chart before, and in the electric blue you see the Merovingians. In the pink you see the Carolingians, which had Charlemagne, one of the greatest rulers of what is now France. In the orange you have the Robertians, and the background color is the Capetians. So you can see that Hugh Capet is a descendant both of the Merovingians and the Carolingians, giving him quite an edge on other descendants. So here you have Paris, and I just put a couple pictures. One is a representation of Paris during the 11th or 12th century, and just to give you a reference, I put a map of current day Paris. So if you look at the Middle Age representation of Paris, you can see that the river there divides in 2. And you can find that little divide if you kind of follow the river from left to right. You see a larger red dot there on the river. So there you see that division of the river in 2. So that tiny little part is the oldest part of Paris. So if you go to Paris, this is where you're going to find the Cathedral of Chartres, and you're going to find something called l'Île de la Cité, which is the oldest part of France where you can't have any cars. It's this tiny little island, and you really feel like you are in the Middle Ages. Of course, it's one of the most expensive parts of Paris, but it's absolutely beautiful if you get a chance to go. Okay, let's go back to this slide. And so we're talking about the expansion of power of the Capetian dynasty. And one of the reasons for the expansion of power was good marriage. And the Capetians were generally seen as being a good catch for people since they were directly related to the Merovingians and the Carolingians. So in one case, with Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was considered to be the most eligible woman of her time. She was not a Capetian, but she married into that family. And one of the reasons she was the most eligible woman of her time was because her dad had left her a vast area of land. So whoever she married received that land as well. And she married twice, both times to distant relatives. So her first marriage was with King Louis VII of France, and that marriage was annulled. She had 2 children with him, but they were both daughters, so the marriage was annulled. She later on married King Henry II of England and had 8 children with him. And of those 8 children, 3 of them became king, and including Richard I, Richard the Lionhearted, which has been made famous by the Crusades. If you remember, he was on the Third Crusade, famous king of England. Now, there are some other interesting things about Eleanor of Aquitaine. She actually accompanied her husband, Louis VII, on the Second Crusade. And when she was married to King Henry II, she plotted against the king along with one of her sons. For that, she was thrown in jail, and she was released only after the king's death. After the king's death, Richard I took over as king, and when he went on the Crusades, the Third Crusade, Eleanor took over as regent. So, though women could not technically rule, she took over the duties and took care of the territories for Richard. So, she was kind of the de facto ruler, but those are called regents when it's not the actual king or queen. Okay, so Eleanor comes with a lot of land. Whoever gets that land increases their power substantially. And this causes some issues for some. In France, Philip Augustus is king. In England, Richard I is king. But Richard I is off at the Crusades. So Eleanor of Aquitaine is the regent. And just to remind you where we are in time, it's the mid-12th century, so around 1150. So right now, the territories that Eleanor of Aquitaine had with her belong to England. They used to belong to France when she was married to the French king, but now she's married to the English king, or she's a widow from the English king, and her son is king of England. But the French want those lands. So Philip Augustus is, he doesn't appear to be a very nice man. He wants the land and decides to make a play for it. So he decides to do so. Why not? Let's do it while Richard is off at the Crusades and Eleanor is in charge. So he plays all of his cards. He does everything possible to gain the land. So he uses warfare, war tactics, but also politics. He uses a lot of politics. He's a very political person and sets these people, the French vassals of Richard I, he sets them up against Richard I. So he kind of has, how would you say? He's got kind of a little band, a little gang that he sets up against Richard I. So it works. So the result is that much of the British territory fall into the hands of the Capetian, greatly increasing the land that the Capetians have under their holding. So here you can see on the map, you can see in orange the territory inherited by Henry II. And in pink, you have Eleanor of Aquitaine's holdings. So vast holdings, big loss for the British. Okay, so in this slide, we have a little video, and it's just to give you a visual representation of the Capetian Empire and how it expanded. So let's take a look. Oops, sorry. So here you can see the Capetian holdings. There are the little bubbles in dark blue. And on the side, on the left-hand side, you have the first category, which is Capetian homes, then non-Capetian homes, and you have the time progression. And what this video also does well, it shows you how unsettled the lands were and how easily things could move from one house's possession to another. So at times you see small territories go, and at times like here, you saw a large, huge swath of land just go, now it just went back. So these could be marriages, or these could be political games, or these could be actual warfare situations. based on the way the Romans actually divided up France. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And this is just a graphic representation of the Capetian dynasty. So you can kind of see how things evolved. And here is a list of the Capetian kings. So here you have the whole Capetian dynasty. The last king, Philip V, is part of the Capetian family, but is not a direct descendant of Hugh Capet. So let's see, there were a couple here that were kind of interesting. So Philip Augustus is Philip II, and he's the one who managed to take back a lot of the land that he thought belonged to France, take back kind of the Angevin Empire. Louis IX was called Saint Louis. And then if you keep going, go down to John I. He was king for 5 days. He was born in 1316 and he died in 1316. He only lived for 5 days, but during those 5 days he was king. So that makes him one of the only kings to have ruled from the date of his birth to the date of his death, which is a little dreary, but it's not the best claim to fame, but that's John I. And the last Capetian king really is Charles IV. And Charles IV dies without any heirs, which is why they had to kind of expand their definition of who could be king, and they went for Philip. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the kings. So not only did they vastly expand their territory, they also expanded their powers. So they expanded their powers in 3 ways. In the legislature, in the tax system, and also as far as justice goes. So Philip Augustus quadrupled the territory. Louis VIII expanded the territory southward, and that included a town called Avignon. And Avignon is a special town because it actually used to be the seat of the papacy. So there used to be 2 popes. Now there's only 1, but at some point in time there were 2 popes, which you can imagine might cause some problems. So what happens under the Capetians is that the office, if you will, of king is given much more credence. So it's not just the person anymore, it's the place that they hold. So from beginning with Louis IX, St. Louis, the king has expanded powers to legislate, and they kind of base their system on Roman law. So this idea of the king being not just a person, but a situation, if you will. One of the ways that it manifests itself is that you find the image of the king on money. So beforehand, you might have something else. You might have a regional lord, or you might have some other figure on the coins. But increasingly, you find the king's face on the coins, and the monetary system becomes a little bit more reliable, if you will, or more standardized, as these are the king's coins, and you have a more reliable value to them if you want. Also, another thing that happens during this time, so the king has the power to legislate, and the king's court becomes much larger. So the king's entourage grows, and when it at some point reached a number of 5,000. So you can imagine having 5,000 advisors in one place. I mean, think about our president. They have a cabinet, but they don't have 5,000 people influencing their decision. So what starts happening is that these people become more organized. So under the Capetian dynasty, you see a more organized form of government. So if you remember, Charlemagne would send out envoys. So he had envoys that were sent out to kind of regulate situations and judge and all that stuff. But under the Capetians, you almost find something reminiscent of what we have today with the Senate and House of Representatives, where you have large groups in the IRS and the Supreme Court. You have groups of people organizing themselves into different types of branches, such as accountancy, legislature, and branches of that sort. So it's becoming more organized, and we're now around the beginning of the 13th century. And another thing that was done around this time was to assign representatives to specific areas. So now you would have a representative of the government living in that region, not just an envoy coming in and checking on things, but you would have that representative actually living there, which we might be able to kind of compare to governors. So you can see that this network, this governmental network, is becoming much more complicated, complex, and starting to resemble something that we know in the modern world. So we're moving forward, and as you know, American democracy was kind of shaped by the concepts put forth in France. Okay, and what this brings about too is also that the role of these representatives and the role of the people who are, let's say, in the more judicial branch or who are in the more financial branch, their roles become more clearly defined as to what exactly they are supposed to do. But still, the king is seen as the ultimate source of knowledge, power, and justice. So with the king being retaining that much power, he has the power to legislate, he has the power to appoint. It's still power being held by one single person, right? So it kind of depends a lot on what that person's agenda is, and we're living in an age where the Crusades are happening, holy war against the infidels, meaning Christianity first above all. And one of the consequences of this is that Jewish people were ostracized. So if you did not conform to the ideals that were set forth by the king and implemented by the government, you could be heavily ostracized. So at this point, Jewish people are ostracized and are forced to live away from society. They're forced to live in what we could call ghettos. And they were not the only group that was ostracized. We also find lepers, people suffering from leprosy, who were heavily ostracized and also sent to live off in their own communities, away from society. Of course, leprosy, is a disease, is a condition that can be contagious. So you can imagine at that time the fear of becoming a leper would be very strong. So another group that was also ostracized were prostitutes. They were also confined to specific areas, and women were believed to, they were supposed to be chaste and pure, and often prostitutes were seen as just temptresses and just terrible people, just the worst of what women could be. So we're going to talk about women, the role of women, and the expectation on women in the next slide. So here we go. Okay, so as I said, women were perceived as being temptresses. So, we probably all know the story of Adam and Eve, where Eve tempted Adam with the apple, right? Adam was somehow coerced into eating that apple. So women were basically excluded from uh, all circles in society. They could not be priests, they could not become warriors, they could not perform many of the duties and jobs that men could do, especially men from wealthier families. So let's say they would not be able to have any say in the governance of a region or talk about the legislature or anything like that. So their influence was severely restricted, and often they were just perceived as mostly physical beings and were expected to be the virginal, pure, innocent women that we sometimes see depicted in movies, and try to be held up to that ideal of never being corrupted. Um, okay, but was that always the case? Not really. One of the things that did happen was that they did protect the sanctity of marriage now. So at this point in time, we see that when a couple gets married, um, one of the rules that they set forth was that the marriage had to be consummated. So that was kind of a new rule. And also, they were toying with the idea of marriage as a sacrament. So marriage is becoming a sacrament. So part of the church, one of the highest things that you can do. So sacraments, if you're not familiar with them, you have the sacrament of baptism, where you're brought into the church, and being baptized means that your soul can now be saved. You have the sacrament of communion, where you willingly accept Christ into your life. So if you become a priest, you have a certain sacrament. If you get married, you have a different sacrament. At this point, marriage is becoming part of the church and something that's protected by the church. And basically what that means is that marriage becomes a contract, something that people need to stick to and be responsible for. So what happens to women who don't get married? Most often they would go to the convent. They would become nuns. That was the option for unwed women. So women functioned as almost persons who held some advantage. So you would marry a woman to bring advantage to your family. So to bring land, to bring powerful relationships, to bring something that you did not have before, which is dowry, basically. Dowry is the property that the woman's family gives to the man's family for kind of thanking them for taking in charge this other charge of being responsible for this charge, this responsibility. So they're being thanked for that by land or property, cows, what have you. Okay, so women would either basically get married or join the convent. So yes, they were pawns. No, they weren't able to really be on their own because they weren't allowed to be a warrior. They weren't allowed to have jobs that were available at the time, and they weren't really allowed to become a priest. They weren't allowed to rule, so they weren't allowed a lot of things. So what women did is they exerted influence where they could, and we're not talking about peasants. We're talking about women who are coming from well-to-do families who have things to offer. If you're a woman and you're a peasant, it in a way it doesn't even factor into the equation because you marry another peasant. Things are just different. So you might also at a lower level have dowry and those things, and maybe they will give you what they can, but in this case we're talking about more influential families and what women would do to kind of exert power coming from a more influential family. So what women would do is act as consultants to men. So if they were married to a powerful man, if they were the mother of a powerful man, if they knew powerful priests, or if they could somehow have the ear of these people and turn them, maybe perhaps you could use the word manipulate them in a certain direction, but this is all that they could do really. So you have these two cases we talked about. Eleanor of Aquitaine, she had the ear of some extremely powerful men. And we also have the example of Blanche of Castile. So Blanche of Castile is actually Eleanor of Aquitaine's granddaughter. And she is the mother of Louis IX, Saint Louis, and also the mother of Isabella, who also gained some repute in the church and was beatified. So she acted as the regent when Louis IX was named king. He was still a minor. So while Louis IX was still a minor and still getting his education, Blanche acted as the regent, and people were not happy having a woman regent, but she was able to navigate those choppy waters, and she was able to rule effectively. She was a big believer in religion and education. And the fact that her son Louis was named Saint Louis and that her daughter Isabella was beatified only lended more credence to the Capetian dynasty being chosen by God to rule those territories. So it kind of just solidified that stance and that idea. Okay, so for the most part, if women had any influence, it was covert, right? They had to use their power of persuasion to influence others and speak with their male relatives or acquaintances, but they had no public voice in society. Whereas, on the other hand, men were being given a greater voice. So prior to this time period, we only had two groups that were influential on the state, and those were the clergy and the nobility, right? If you remember the feudal system and you look at that pyramid, the people in the castle, the people on the court advising the king are the nobility, the clergy, and the nobility can include lords. It can include it'll even include the knights, right? So kind of knights are sort of in the nobility tract, but the bottom of the pyramid, the peasants, had no say whatsoever. And now we're entering a new era where the rest of the population actually has a say. So this is what was called the Third Estate. So the Third Estate, like I said, before there were two estates, the clergy, which was the first order, and the nobility, which was the second order. Third estate is the rest of the population, and they are now allowed a greater say in governance. And this came about under Philip the Fair, who wanted to consult others and wanted to hear other people's ideas and other people's perspective and take things into account and not just make decisions based on what he and a small group of people around him thought. So this is a big shift, right? I mean, it's, if you think about it in a way, it's the foundation of democracy. Well, in France, but well, you know. Okay, so the third estate is the idea that everyone, in some regard, may have a say in governance. Everyone, but let's point out, except for women. Women still don't have a say, it's just men. So this kind of shows that the king is not necessarily a harsh ruler or omnipotent, but he can look at different points of view to make an educated decision that may be beneficial to a greater number of people. So this might be good for the third estate, but is it good for the first estate, the clergy? Most likely, the clergy might not be so happy, the church might not be so happy with other people having a greater say in things. And let's recontextualize this. This is still a period of the Crusades, and we are having, not only is the church fighting a holy war abroad, the church is also having issues maintaining and regulating its power within Europe. It was having many issues with the German Empire, and also with France. So the question as to who can influence who. Can the church influence the state? Can the state influence the church? They both want to have greater control. So we're in this kind of power struggle between the church and the state within Europe. And now we're being told, the church is being told, well, the population has a say in it too. So they might not be extremely happy about that. So one such example of this is Philip the Fair and Louis IX, St. Louis, wanted to levy taxes on the clergy. Obviously, the clergy would be completely against that. Things kind of came to a head, and the Pope at the time was Pope Boniface, and Pope Boniface and Philip the Fair had an altercation that led to violence, and the Pope died at Philip's hand. This was not the result that they had anticipated, but this is what happened. So the consequence or the effect of this is that what they did is that they elected a pope. So France elected its own pope. So not the Roman Pope, a French Pope. So, like I said before, Avignon is a town of some importance in France because it was the seat of the papacy. And for a time, there were two popes. One of them was in France, and one of them was in Rome. So this was France's solution, was to elect its own pope. Okay, let's talk about some other changes in society. So just to kind of go over things a little bit real quick, women have not many rights, if any, but we are seeing a government that is more structured, more well-defined, with different levels of what you could call bureaucracy. Also, you're seeing, and divisions, so divisions between the judicial, the revenue system, and, you know, well, those are the two main ones at that point. And we're also seeing regional representatives that are staying in the region, not just envoys. So we have a system, you know, kind of a spider web, if you will, if you want to think about it that way. Okay, there are many changes in society at that point in time. So we're in the era of Crusades, and one of the reasons for starting the Crusades was to kind of focus the aggression of knights onto some greater cause. So if you remember before the Crusades, um, there were a lot of territorial disputes, and knights would be sent out from one town to a next, and they would just do whatever they wanted. They would rob, they would pillage. So the Crusades served this function of kind of focusing their attention on something else, and also tying in the military with the church and giving them a sense of morality and doing good instead of just amassing things. So we also had, prior to that, we had the Vikings, which is why the knights came about to help fight the Vikings. So we've had some long periods of very violent people, and now a lot of these violent people are gone fighting the Crusades, and the people that remain are doing better. So at this period in time, we kind of see some greater social mobility. So the peasants are able to produce more and have a surplus. So the surplus, they're able to sell it. So we can see some increase in trade. And we also have, because of the Crusades, we also have some some new techniques, and they are mining more. They're using their resources more efficiently and producing more. Let's just say that the threat of violence is gone. The weather is actually better than it has been in the past, and they are using better techniques to plow the land, and also they're mining for silver and other precious metals. So things are moving in the right direction for a lot of people. Okay, so what happens when you have a period of tranquility, of increased production of agricultural products, better technology? Well, you have a population boost. So during this time period, the population actually increases quite a bit. Now, what the population increase does is that, number one, it increases the need for people to innovate, to figure out how to take care of these people and how to, the logistics of having more people. But the other thing that it does is obviously provide a much greater workforce. So what they did to accommodate this increase in population was they started reclaiming land that was previously wild. So going into the forest, chopping down the trees. I mean, we're all familiar with this type of thing. Going into swamps and kind of draining the water from the swamps, and so technology is advancing, and they're figuring out, where there's a will, there's a way. If the need leads them to creation of new technology. So, all in all, during that time period, about 30,000 towns were formed. So that's a lot of towns. So even though we have a king ruling over the entire territory, we obviously still have, there's still a regional ruler. And a lot of times these regional rulers are still abiding by the feudal system. And the way that works is that the lord owns, the king owns the land, but the lord rules over that land and manages that land, and he decides who can and cannot use the land. So the peasants on the land are subjected to the whims of the lord, and the lord, the demands from the lords grew. So if they wanted, they wanted more. They wanted to go on hunts. They wanted to have more wine. They wanted to have more luxuries. So their demands were the responsibility of the peasants. So they started asking more of the peasants to fulfill their desires, and to have parties and feasts, and eat what they wanted. So these were burdens on the peasants, so that the Lord could enjoy his time as Lord. And what were the peasants to do? Because this was the land that they farmed. This was what they survived on. So the only thing that they can do is just to leave and go out into the wild, or go, work for another lord and beg another lord for a tiny piece of land. So their choices were not that great. But given the times, and given the fact that conditions were good, some peasants did thrive under these conditions and found themselves with a surplus, and they would bring this surplus to market and sometimes export it. So you would find towns near a big river, and these towns would be very amenable. They would be very good for exporting. So, if you're along a river, you could export from France to Germany, let's say, in not that much time. So they would be able to bring their goods to market, sell them at market, and this was something that the lords noticed. And the lords thought, well, how about we just make a market by the castle, and they can bring their goods close to the castle, and we can profit from what they are making. So, we can easily take some bread, or we can easily get the best produce, or whatever. So now we have castles that are surrounded by markets, right? So that in a way, if you think about it, it's kind of what we know as modern day cities, right? So you have the downtown, where you have the center for legislative power, and people live in their big high rises, and around that you have commerce, and they're all very near together. Now, what this does is it brings people of different classes together. So whereas the lord, or even the nobility, would not have much interaction with the peasants, in this situation, you could see, because of geographical proximity, you would see more interaction. It becomes more like what we picture a city today, where you have your local stores, and you might know your vendors and those types of things. So you can see a society that is definitely changing. And in another way, what's changing is that we are not dealing just with nobility, warriors, clergy, peasant. We're now seeing a service industry. So the service industry might be medical men, it might be scribes, it might be lawmen, merchants, manufacturers, so people who take basic goods but make them into something else. And this is a new development. So this, in turn, leads to a different type of societal organization, if you will. It leads to guilds, and people being organized by trade. So they're organized now by what they do, not so much where their social class, what their social status is, or their political or religious beliefs, but their skills. So obviously this is very comparable to unions today and conferences. If you go to a conference for nurses, these are all like-minded people. So we start seeing that develop during this time period. And so the 12th century is a period of Renaissance in France. There's a renewed interest in the classics, and by classics we mean Greeks and Romans. But they're also being exposed to new art, new philosophies, new technologies due to the Crusades. The people coming back from the Crusades are bringing back things that are completely exotic and foreign and provocative, um, philosophically and technologically. So they're being exposed to just something that they've never seen before. So they're thinking back to the past, and they're also just realizing that there's a whole different world out there. It's not just what they know. It's there are a multitude of possibilities. So we're going to talk about now a little bit this period of Renaissance because it's a really beautiful period. Okay, so let's talk about the language. Latin is still the predominant language of culture. And by culture, I don't mean that people are speaking Latin. I mean that if you are going to deal with judicial affairs, if you are going to deal, the church, these were in Latin. So if you went to church, church was not given in your dialect. Church was given in Latin. If you had a judicial matter that you needed to solve, those were done in Latin. So it's kind of interesting because when you think about it, people are going to church and not really understanding what is being said. So this is also one of the reasons why these cathedrals, these churches were such places of entertainment for people, is because they couldn't even listen to the Mass because the Mass is given in Latin. So the chances of everybody understanding it are pretty low. But they did get to hear singing, and they did get to see beautiful architecture and something different. So anyways, so Latin is still the predominant language of culture, meaning church, state, and education, really. Francian, which is the language, the dialect spoken by the Capetians, is gaining status, meaning it's a language of power. So if you think about today's society, you would think of English. English is the language of power in the world today, but it hasn't always been so, and it might not always be so in the future. At some point, French was. At some point, Latin was. So those things change. But right now, English is the language of power. Let's say compared to one of the languages spoken in Belgium, which is Dutch. Belgium and Holland. Belgium and Holland have very low status because nobody speaks it other than Belgians and Dutch people. Okay, so Francian is gaining status, and it's a dialect. So there are many dialects in the French territories. Francian is not the most widely spoken dialect. It's just one of the dialects, but it has more prestige. So what makes a dialect versus a language? The definition of a language basically is that if you have an army and a navy, you're a language. If you don't, then you're pretty much a dialect. So it's power, right? And rules also. Okay, so there are many dialects. There's two groups of dialects, the southern dialects and the northern dialects. So in the south, they're called Languedoc, and in the French, they're called, in the northern part, they're called Langue d'Oil. So let's see, we're going to talk a little bit about language in music, because this is one of the things that is pretty beautiful about the 12th century is the music. So the troubadours and the chansons de geste, we see an emergence of these, and they're comparable to our pop stars today. Um, much of it's basically poetry set to music. A lot of string instruments, some percussions, some horns, but portable. They're portable instruments, and the topics that were sung about were mostly just love and war. So these are epic songs. It's the period of the Crusades. Um, it's the love between a damsel and a knight, or a king and his queen, or the king and his country. Um, so these are evocative songs, and people would sit around and listen to them. And we're gonna listen to one here, and it also kind of it's like a Renaissance fair in France. Um, and let's see, I think this one is a song of war.
C'est le prince d'Orange, tout le matin s'est levé. C'est le prince d'Orange, tout le matin s'est levé. Et d'aller voir son page, va c'est mon coursier. Mais que maudit soit la guerre, va c'est mon coursier. Ô beau prince d'Orange, où voulez-vous aller? Ô beau prince d'Orange, où voulez-vous aller? Je veux aller en France où le roi m'a mandé. Que maudit soit la guerre où le roi m'a mandé. Mis la main sur la bride, le pied dans l'étrier. Mis la main sur la bride, le pied dans l'étrier. Je partis sain et sauf et j'en revins blessé. Mais que maudit soit la guerre où j'en revins blessé. Deux, trois grands coups de lance qu'un Anglais m'a donné. Deux, trois grands coups de lance qu'un Anglais m'a donné. J'en ai un à l'épaule et l'autre à mon côté. Que maudit soit la guerre et l'autre à mon côté. Le beau prince d'Orange est mort et enterré. Le beau prince d'Orange est mort et enterré. Les vues portées en terre par quatre cordeliers. Que maudit soit la guerre par quatre cordeliers.
Okay, so that song, that chanson de geste, was about William of Orange, and it spoke of the horrors of war and just how terrible war is, and so a lot of those songs were about either war or love. Okay, let's look at a different aspect of the Renaissance, which is education, because a lot was done in education. So at this point, we see universities emerge. This is when the Paris University is founded. Um, Up until now, education was strongly tied to religion. The clergy was mainly responsible for educating the youth, but now we see an interest in studying different schools of thought and comparing philosophies and studying art, law, literature, architecture. And a lot of this is influenced by contact with the Middle East, because they're now learning that there are other schools of thought, other philosophies, other technologies that work really well. And so this renews an interest in knowledge, and not just a focus on religion, but expanding to understand different philosophies and different technologies and different techniques. So at this point, we do see many universities come through. And this movement of increasing education was fully supported by the Capetians. They encouraged the study of law and services, especially since their system of government and administration was growing so rapidly and so vastly during this period. So educating new servicemen in law and philosophy and religion and governance was actually an important thing to do. And what we see here is the study of architecture, which is going to lead to some absolutely beautiful things. And we're going to look at one of those now. And this is the Chartres Cathedral, which was built after a fire burnt down the church. And the architect is not known. And the shape of churches and cathedrals prior to this was, let's say, as a bullet. And here we're seeing the Gothic style. So let's take a look at it. So if you look at this, it's not exactly a bullet. It's actually in the shape of a cross. So Chartres was unconventional in the fact that it was built in the shape of a cross. And you can see all those intersecting lines are reflective of the Gothic style, the arches in the Gothic style. Okay, so here is Chartres, and you can see how tall it is. It's an extremely tall building, and the purpose of this was to show that man is reaching higher, to get closer to God. So the thought was that they are almost touching God, and it's showing God how much man wants to be close to him, and how much reverence man has for God by trying to reach God. And you can see the beautiful Paris sky, which is very typical of Paris to have that type of gray sky, the green roof. And if you look in the center there, which is where the cross part would be formed, you see a circle, and we're going to talk about that circle. It's called the rose window, and it's just tremendous. So here we have the inside of the Chartres Cathedral. And the first thing that should hit you is the height. The height. There's actually, in the picture, there are one or two people, just to give you perspective on how tall and how majestic and just absolutely amazing this is. You know, when you think about the fact that this was built in the 13th century time period, just imagine the skills needed, the artistry, the manpower, how many people had to die for these buildings to be built. Just tremendous. And here you have one of the components that's characteristic of Gothic cathedrals. The arches, unlike Roman style cathedrals, the arches go to a point. They don't just circle around like a circle, they actually culminate to a point. So that's very typical of Gothic style. And the other thing that should hit you is the windows, the use of so many windows and so much light. So just picture yourself, and as some people are able to do, every week going to this cathedral for a few hours and listening to a mass in Latin, and perhaps listening to some Benedictine monk singing. It would be quite a meditation, and just absolutely gorgeous when you see the detail that goes into these windows. It's just amazing. Okay, so this is the rose window scene from the outside of the cathedral, and even just in the arch, the entrance archway, just look at the details that that went into this cathedral. The gargoyles, if you see typical Parisian gargoyles, typical, just every part of this is so detailed that it would take thousands of pictures to really do it justice. But I encourage you to kind of look on it on your own to see all the tremendous detail work that went into this, and the amazing architecture and thought that really it's impressive. So on the outside you have, there's a rose window, which is that circular window, and here is the view of the rose window from the inside of the cathedral. And I just have to point out the colors are tremendous, and it's so difficult to even explain the amount of work, painstaking work, that must have gone into making these. First of all, you have to make the colored glass. Second of all, you have to fit all those pieces together perfectly to make these gorgeous images. And they have to be fit with metal around them. Most likely lead was used to bring the pieces of glass together to form images. Just the detail. Please go on the internet and look at these windows in cathedrals and churches in Europe. They're just hypnotic. So this was the period of Renaissance. So you have a confluence of philosophy, technology, and art. You have trade that's starting to blossom. You have people branching into other lines of work in the service area, judicial and medicine, and things are booming. Things look good. They might not look good forever, but they're looking good right now, and they're still not looking good for women. We can say that still. Okay, so we come to the end of the Capetians in the 14th century. So at the end of this chapter, we basically come to the end of the Capetians. It wasn't a desired outcome. It happened through kind of a set of unique circumstances. Any potential heirs died. Any potential heirs to Charles IV died. The women, there might have been some women, and we're talking, what they try to do is to keep it as close to the direct lineage as possible. So ideally, the first choice would be first son, right? Second choice would be second son. But then maybe you could go to a grandson, or something like that. But you don't really want to go to a nephew so much. You don't really want to branch out that far. So, anyways, no sons available to become king, or they all died. Now there was a nephew, Edward III, but he was English. So the French did not want to have anything to do with England, and they just did everything possible to find somebody else. And so finally, they did find somebody else who wasn't, let's say he's not that far removed. He was the son of the brother of the king, so basically a nephew. So Philip, Duke of Valois, called Philip the Fortunate, because he was not meant to be king, becomes the new king of France. So, and this is where the chapter leaves off. So let's just get to some conclusions. Not an easy time for women, but they can have influence. So they're not completely shut out of society, but they have a very covert role and are not accepted as intellectual equals of men. The church, there's still an ongoing fight with the church and the state, so we'll see where that goes. Peasants, society as a whole, the bottom of the pyramid is getting wealthier and producing a surplus, or at least some are, and able to kind of branch out into different directions, be it trade and commerce and perhaps some other things, and move into the service area, not just the agricultural area. So we have a strong period of Renaissance, which is fantastic. Some absolutely amazing things came out of that time. A lot of it due to things that they learned in the Middle East and brought back with them. It kind of shifted the mindset of the people of the time. So this is all fantastic for now, but as perhaps you may imagine, we have larger groups of populations living together in smaller areas, and we are not living in the most hygienic times. So we're sharing water, we're putting our garbage out on the street, we're not taking baths, and we are living with a lot of people. So in the next chapter, we're going to kind of see where that leads us to. So I will see you then. Also, I'll put the assignments, discussion questions on Canvas, so you can check for those. But I probably won't do too much since I know that you have a lot of work, and you're going to have I'm going to be giving you your midterm pretty soon. So, okay, thank you. Goodbye.